One thing I recently noticed while playing Immortal Empires for Total War Warhammer 3 was the design of the Soulgrinders. Typically, this is what us tabletop hobbyists are used to when we imagine the Soulgrinder, but Total War approached their god-marked demonic war engines with a little more individuality. Each of the Chaos Gods have their own Soulgrinder unit, subtly designed to better match their patron god, which got me thinking. What if I took this line of thinking a little further than just a slightly different head and paint job? What if I built 4 exorbitantly priced Soulgrinders for no other reason than them looking cool? To begin this project, I needed 4 Soulgrinder kits to serve as the basis of the conversions. As each of the metal limbs would be, for the most part, the same across each one, I could prep all 4 of them before I started on the customizations. I approached each Soulgrinder lower half one at a time to ensure that I didn't accidentally mix up the parts, but each one was tackled in the same way. I first clipped away the components from the sprue before cleaning up the mold lines with my knife. As these parts are from the nearly 20-year-old Defiler model, they're not quite as well made as some of the more modern sets are. As such, the mold lines have become a lot more pronounced due to the age of the molds, and the parts don't quite line up perfectly with each other, leaving an unsightly gap. I tried to mitigate this as best I could by using some small clamps and plenty of plastic glue, but this left me with a defined join. So I decided to resolve this by dipping into my pot of sprue glue. For those of you unfamiliar with this concoction, it's basically a half-empty pot of Tamiya extra thin with a few finely chopped chunks of sprue chucked in. The plastic melts down to create this viscous paste that is great for painting into these kinds of gaps. Once dried, it basically becomes plastic again, allowing me to shave it away, leaving the flat, smooth surface behind. To speed up this process of building 12 pairs of legs, I opted to apply my sprue glue directly to the contact points, rather than just using the regular glue. The benefit of this was that when I clamped the parts together, the excess sprue glue oozed out from the gaps, filling them in. These were allowed to dry like before and cut back to reveal a seamless surface. This process of sprue gluing, clamping and shaving was repeated on the main bodies too, until I was left with 4 bodies and 24 legs, all prepped and ready for their upper halves to be added. The first god that I would tackle would be Slaanesh, but before work began on the Soulgrinder itself, I needed to build up the base. Being so large and having lots of easily posable legs meant that I didn't need to settle for just having the machine sat on a flat surface. To add some variation to the surface, I reached for one of my favourite basing materials, the humble cork floor tile. I've always liked using these because they're cheap, easy to get a hold of, and extremely simple to work with. Some topography was created by tearing up some of the large pieces of the tile and stacking progressively smaller pieces on top to build up the height. This was all done without any glue initially. I wanted to make sure that everything looked right before it was made permanent. But once I was happy with the look, some superglue was used to combine the cork chunks to both each other and to the base. With the first rocks in place, small elements were torn up and these were glued around the larger ones to help remove some of that stepped appearance and also to break up some of the flatter areas between the rock clumps. Now that I had the rocks in place, I could concentrate on assembling the Soulgrinder's legs in such a way that made them appear as though they were interacting with the environment around them, rather than just being perched precariously on top. Fortunately, the Soulgrinder's legs are ball sockets, which allow me to fix the legs to the body without making their position permanent. This meant that I could tweak the leg's position and try out a few poses until I was happy. The pose I finalised on had the right set of legs slightly raised up on the rocks whilst keeping the midsection fairly level. While they were still in their dry fitted position, I then applied my glue whilst keeping everything in place. This allowed me to retain that desired leg position. This process of basing, dry fitting the legs and then gluing to the midsection would be something I repeat across my other Soulgrinders too. With the legs completed, I could work on the torso. The Soulgrinder comes with a generic demon torso, but as I wanted to dedicate it to the god Slaanesh, I needed something more specific, and it was the Keeper of Secrets Greater Demon that would provide me with the bulk of the Slaaneshi theming. However, the Keeper of Secrets already came with legs, so these needed to be removed in order to create the mechanical centaur, and so I started out by taking a pencil and making a mark across the full circumference of the torso, just above where the tail would normally be. Using this mark as a guide, I used my saw to separate the legs from the torso. starting with the front before repeating on the back half. With the cuts made, the edges were cleaned up and softened a little using the edge of my blade. From here, I could assemble the torso, followed by the 4 arms. To make lining everything up easier, I settled on the sword-carrying right hand and the empty left hand. Attaching the Keeper of Secrets torso to the legs was the next challenge. The torso didn't easily line up where the regular Soulgrinder torso would be attached, so I decided to use a component that would normally be used on the Defiler kit. After a quick dry fit, I could see that this component would make an excellent go-between. The mechanical waist was glued together, clamped and cleaned up much like the legs were before being loosely attached to the Soulgrinder legs. This gave me a much better idea of how the torso should be placed against the ball joint. When I'd found a good position, I began to make the bond permanent with a mixture of sprue glue and regular glue. Once the glue had dried, I was left with this rather blunt transition from the organic parts of the Keeper of Secrets and the mechanical waste. They need to be blended together, so I turned to the ever useful green stuff, a material I would be making extensive use of during this project. After cutting and mixing some of the putty, I applied some rough lumps to the bottom of the torso and smoothed them out to help soften that transition line. For this, I made sure to use plenty of Vaseline across my tools and fingers to help prevent the putty from sticking. Just make sure you wipe away any remaining residue with a paper towel before painting. To add a little detail to the waist, I decided to sculpt on some strands of stretch skin that had been wrapped around some mechanical parts, fusing the engine to the demon. These were created by rolling out strands of green stuff and wrapping them around some of the jutting pieces of metal before blending them back into the skin. This process was repeated with various directions and thicknesses of strands, whilst also adding in extra folds and creases with my tools to build up that appearance of tension. Once the sculpting was complete, I allowed the green stuff to cure fully before progressing. While I'd used a Slaanesh Greater Demon, I didn't want the model to just look like a Greater Demon on mechanical legs. To remedy this, I opted to use a different head than the ones offered in the kit, specifically one of the 3 heads from the Avatar of Cain. Luckily, the head is roughly in the correct scale, and there are a few shared similarities between Eldar and Slaaneshi aesthetics, no doubt due to their shared history. I did need to make some tweaks though. The first of these was the removal of the tassels from the crest. These were first clipped away and then smoothed back using the blade of my scalpel. Removing the inlaid symbols on the sides of the crest was a little more tricky though. These were first filled in with some more sprue glue and allowed to dry fully. Once it had hardened, the sprue glue could be smoothed flat, removing the sigil that was previously present. With this complete, I could start to work on attaching the head to the Keeper of Secrets neck. After a quick comparison, I could see the helmet wasn't too far off fitting the neck, but it did need to be shaved back a bit and narrowed down to a slight point. After a few trims and comparisons, the new head could be glued into place. The only thing left to do now was to add a few small trinkets that would normally be attached to the Keeper of Secrets to the frame of the Grinder's legs, completing the Slaanesh marked Soulgrinder. But before we go on the guide, let's hear a little bit about the sponsors of today's video, HelloFresh. When I'm not working, I'm probably spending my time kitbashing or editing these videos, so the quick, easy and affordable meals from HelloFresh are perfect for me. HelloFresh offers foolproof, step-by-step recipes that means a much more enjoyable and stress-free cooking experience. Plus, their recipes cut back on time spent in the kitchen, with meals ready in around 30 minutes or even less. HelloFresh has also helped me to free up time it would normally take to come up with a meal idea and go and actually get those ingredients, which just means more time for kitbashing. I get all those fresh ingredients delivered straight to my door. Another major benefit is that everything is already portioned out, which means everything gets used and there is much less waste. Since using HelloFresh, I hardly have any food waste anymore. Plus, HelloFresh is the first carbon-neutral meal kit company, and nearly all the packaging is recyclable. But most importantly, it tastes great too. They have more 5-star reviews than any other meal kit, so you will know you'll get something delicious. Produce gets from the farm to your doorstep in under a week, so you know it's going to be at peak freshness. But what's great about getting sponsored by HelloFresh is that we've already been using the service for over a year now. Before, we used to get stuck in the rut of eating the same boring meals week in and week out. But since signing up, we've enjoyed so much more variety. It's been great to try out new meals and things that we would never have tried cooking before. But don't just take my word for it. Go to hellofresh.com and use code WARGAMER65 for 65% off plus free shipping. Once again, that's WARGAMER65 for 65% off plus free shipping. The next Soulgrinder would be marked by Tzeentch, and I began the build in the same way that I'd approached the previous set of legs. However, I felt that the blades on the legs were a little too much for the Tzeentch theme, so I decided to clip them away first before posing and gluing the legs into their desired position, but I kept the front legs separate for the time being. The torso would be provided by the Lord of Change kit. Fortunately, the legs were already separated from the torso, so after gluing the back and sides together, I just needed to clip away the few remaining parts that sat below the belt. Once these cuts were done, they were flattened out and the front section of the torso piece was glued into place. Finally, the loincloth and front section of the belt was glued on as well, giving a well-defined division between the demonic torso and the mechanical legs. The torso would be fixed to the lower section in much the same way as last time. I first assembled the connector piece before making a test fit against the Tzeentch torso. It fit together pretty well for the most part, but one of the protruding poles was intersecting the loincloth and so needed to be removed. In order to get the angle of the torso right, I began by dry fitting the connector to the legs and placing the torso piece on top. After adjusting the position a little so that the loincloth was fitting right against the legs, I then made the bond permanent and glued the torso and the connector together. When it came to arming my Soulgrinder, I didn't have any options that didn't involve a staff in some way. I didn't really see this as working as an option, so I decided to create my own weapon. The kit also comes with a long curved blade that could be combined with the staff to make an excellent glaive. First, I clipped away the tip of the staff, which I'd already attached the torso to, in order to create a flat surface. In addition to this, the small tab that sat below the sword's blade was also clipped away before both surfaces were filed and shaved flat. The contact point between these two parts was a little small though. Relying on glue alone to hold quite a prominently placed piece would make it very susceptible to being knocked off. To help fix the blade to the staff, I drilled a 1mm hole into the tip of the staff, followed up by another on the underside of the blade. Into the hole in the blade, some 1mm steel wire was superglued into place before being clipped down so just a few millimeters remained protruding. This was in turn superglued into the hole in the staff, creating a much stronger bond in the process. You may have noticed that at this stage, the Lord of Change torso was missing the iconic wings and long-necked bird head. I ultimately decided not to attach these. I just didn't want the model to look like a regular Lord of Change glued to some mechanical legs. But these large gaps around the neck and across the back needed to be filled in, and I would do this in two stages. The first involved blocking out the bulk of the space, and for this I used some milliput. I found it great for sculpting the basic shapes and filling in gaps. You can use water to help smooth it out and really get into all of those recesses. The next step involved a whole box of steel ball bearings of various sizes. This would be used to create something that would help to give this model a very strong Tzeentchian feel. Lots and lots of eyes. These bearings would be glued to the sections that I'd applied the milliput to, but to make this a little easier, I sprayed some superglue activator into a dish. Superglue was added to the intended location and the selected side of ball bearing was dipped into the activator before being placed onto the glue. This hardens the glue almost instantly, avoiding the need to sit holding the model still while the glue dried. This process was then continued until I had a few of these glued into place across the front of the torso. The bearings were a good start, but they didn't really look like eyes yet, and I still had to smooth out those transitions between the plastic, milliput, and the steel bearings. This would be achieved with some green stuff. I steadily built up the small strips of green stuff and laid them around the metal balls, steadily filling out that space. Once the gaps around the eyes had been filled in, a few strips were laid horizontally across the top or bottom parts of the eyes to create some eyelids. Some folds and creases were sculpted in to add a little realism and detail into these areas. Once the eyes on the front were complete and the green stuff I had applied had been given a chance to cure, I could work on the back. Taking a break between these two just helps to prevent accidentally smudging some of the sculpting I'd already done. The eyes on the back were added in the exact same way as before. First by gluing the ball bearings, and then adding the green stuff around them to fill in the gaps and add the eyelets. Once completed, I was left with the following optically gifted demon. Now that I had an idea of how the staff would be positioned, I could attach the front legs of the Soulgrinder before attaching a few small details from the Lord of Change kit to the mechanical body. When it came to the Khorne Soulgrinder, the Bloodthirster was the kit of choice here, although the Scarbrand kit would have made a good alternative. Combining this greater demon to the Soulgrinder legs was pretty straightforward. I assembled the Bloodthirster torso as per the instructions, but before I attached the front plate, I first inserted that mechanical midsection into the stomach cavity. It fit nicely into place without the need for any trimming, so it could be fixed in place with some glue before adding on the stomach plates over the top. Like with the previous Soulgrinders, while I didn't mind borrowing heavily from the Greater Demon kits, I didn't want to just look like a Greater Demon, so I set about modifying the head ever so slightly. I began by assembling the muzzle part of one of the heads, but before I attached the top of the muzzle, I first clipped away and flattened down the horns, Hellboy style. After gluing this section to the rest of the head, it would allow me to add one of the faceplates taken from a Chaos Knight. The change is a subtle one, but by including more metallic elements into the miniature, it helps to blend together the upper and lower parts, as well as diverging away from the original kit. Once the head had been glued into place, I then set about attaching the left arm. I selected the axe-wielding arm and built it as per the instructions before attaching it to the torso. The right arm would be built slightly differently though. Soulgrinders have access to ranged weaponry, and it's something I haven't directly referenced in my other builds. Fortunately, Khorne provides, and I have this excellent skull cannon to graft onto the arm. But first I needed to make a few cuts. Using a saw blade, I first cut across the wrist, just in front of one of the leather straps. Similarly, I separated the barrel of the skull cannon from its mount, repeating the cut on both halves of the cannon. With the cuts made, I cleaned them up and flattened out the surfaces using my knife. Once everything had been prepped, I could glue the two halves of the cannon together, attach them to the wrist, and then attach the arm to the torso. Like with the Tzeentch Soulgrinder, as I had chosen not to attach the wings, I now had a couple of holes in the back. I decided to follow a similar theme to those on the skull cannon's barrel, and this was done by first mixing up some more green stuff. This was pressed into the holes of the back. With a few lumps in place, some skulls were then pressed into the green stuff. I also used a little plastic glue here where the skulls touch the model directly. With a few skulls in place, I pressed more short strips of green stuff around the skulls so that it appeared that the flesh was growing around them. I used my sculpting tools to help blend the putty into the surrounding skin, as well as adding more creases and folds to give the impression that the flesh is being stretched and malformed. Once one side was complete, I repeated the same steps on the other side. With the torso complete, I could begin the posing of the legs, using the same methods that I'd used earlier. With these in place, I could add some of the armor plates to the legs, as well as a few of the impaled skulls that were found within the Soulgrinder kit. The final Soulgrinder to build was the Nurgle Marked One. When choosing the basis of this kit, I did have a few options, including the Glotkin, the Pox Maggots, and of course, the Great Unclean One, with me ultimately settling on the latter. The problem I faced with this kit though, was the fact that it didn't really have an easily discernible set of legs where I could make my union between the mechanical and the demonic, so I had to approach things a little differently. This saw me building the Great Unclean One by following the instructions, but I omitted both the legs and the hands, as well as the head for the time being. Like with the removal of the blades for the Tzeentch Soulgrinder, I also wanted to customize mechanical legs to match the aesthetics of this Nurgle war machine. I would create the appearance of corrosion and decay by drilling in a series of shallow holes across the leg surfaces. By using various sizes of drill bit for this, I was able to add some variation and create more of an organic appearance through corrosion. This process was repeated across the legs and the armor panels before gluing the panels to the legs. The gaps that had been left behind in the Great Unclean One's torso by not attaching the original legs would be where I would attach the mechanical legs. Rather than using the normal Soulgrinder midsection, I imagine that the great bulk of the Soulgrinder's demonic form has spread around and absorbed some of the mechanical parts, leaving the legs sticking out from the folds. I paired up some of the legs and placed these into one side of the torso. These were fixed in place, at least for the time being, with a little superglue. I also made use of some of that earlier superglue activator to speed up the drying time. Once done, this was repeated on the other side. For the front legs, I didn't have any more holes to add them to, so I just need to glue them directly to the stomach. But before I did this, I first sawed away the ball joints from those front legs before cleaning up the cuts. I did a little more trimming to make the ends slightly concave to fit better against the curved stomach, and once this was done, the legs were superglued into place. After attaching the legs at the sides, there was still quite a large amount of empty space. So to fill these, I took some of the sections of the original legs that I'd not added earlier and cut them up so they could be attached to their original spots. I steadily built up these sections as much as I could do without intersecting with the mechanical legs, but I did avoid adding anything like obvious toes or feet. This would cut down massively on the gap filling I would need to do later on. I could now begin work on the head. Like with the other Soulgrinders, this would also be a point of modification. I began by attaching the first two parts of the Cyclopean Great Unclean One head, leaving the actual faceplate off. Then, I took the stomach teeth that would normally be fixed to the Rotigus variant and positioned these vertically where the face would normally be, allowing the eye to show through between the teeth. Now, attaching this mouth had left quite a few gaps around the sides, which would be filled in by first clipping away the tentacles from Roticus's left arm. These were cleaned up and trimmed to a slight point in order to allow them to be inserted around the edges of the mouth. This resulted in an eldritch looking creature and helped to separate it out a little from the other Great Unclean One head options, but there were still a few gaps that needed to be filled, and these would be tackled later on. But first, I needed to attach the hands. For the left hand, I took the flail hand and removed the handle from the fist. I first clipped away the protruding parts and then removed the rest with my knife, shaving back the plastic until the form of the hand was recreated. The lack of weapons here was necessary, as the front legs would have gotten in the way of the hook blade or the flail. For the right hand, I decided to follow the course I'd taken with the Khorne Soulgrinder and grabbed the heavy blight launcher from the fetid bloat drone. The pipes needed to be cut away and shaved flat, and the right wrist also needed to be adjusted to allow the weapon to be fixed to it. But once everything was been prepared, the weapon was glued together before being glued directly to the wrist. So, at this point, the model had all of its parts attached. The legs, arms and head were all there, but so were many gaps that all needed to be filled in. Like with the earlier Tzeentch Soulgrinder, I began with some milliput. This was cut and mixed before being pressed into those gaps from inside the model. I found that attaching these patches inside out meant that I could press against the insides of the edge and give the putty a good grip on the model without having to mask some of the details on the skin. Like earlier, I didn't worry about adding any texture or detail just yet, and focused mainly on plugging up all of those gaps. With this task achieved, I left the milliput to cure and harden overnight. Green stuff would be used to create the detail. This would be used extensively, not only to add texture and detail to the gaps I filled in the last step, but also to help to create a smoother transition between the organic and mechanical parts. I followed the precedent already created by the sagging flesh and pockmarked skin of the Great Unclean One. All the while I was sculpting on these details, I made extensive use of rubber-tipped tools and Vaseline. This combination really helped to achieve those smooth blends and natural shapes. Just make sure you wipe away any remaining surface residue before you do start painting. After adding sagging lumps of flesh, boils and broken skin across all of those previously mentioned areas, the Nurgle Mark Soulgrinder was finally complete, and all it needed to be doing now was to paint all four of them, which left me with these. And there we have the 4 completed God-marked Soulgrinders. Now I didn't show the painting this time around, as, to be honest, a lot of the techniques I used were a little bit experimental. Plus this video is already pretty long and I wouldn't want to take up too much of your time. Now of course this conversion is by no means economical, which, let's face it, very few of my conversions ever are. But if you're looking to add a Soulgrinder to your Chaos armies and want to add a little personal touch to them, then hopefully this guide will help you out. It's been a while since I've done a big kit bash like this, or one that was inspired by Warhammer Total War. so it's been nice to return to this style of video. If you enjoyed it as much as I did, then let me know in the comments along with suggestions of what big kit bashes you'd like to see me tackle in the future. So, before I go, let me say a big thank you to the ever wonderful patrons who keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters who are Brushlick and Nim, Jonathan Hart, Ryan Little, Tim, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, David Timothy, Jake, Jesse Smith, Casper Limborg, Morgan, and Swedsman. If you're interested in supporting me too, you can find a link to my Patreon below, where supporters can get ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Plus you'll be helping me out in the process. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.